What is the state of Washington, D.C., your nation's capital? Perhaps you've seen on the news that there is a wall that has been erected along with a military garrison to protect those in power up on Capitol Hill. But what they don't want to show you is what's happening all around the rest of D.C. For people who live in D.C., they don't care about our safety. And that's pretty obvious if you've lived here over the summers. Pretty obvious if you walk the streets today. It's middle of a blizzard here in Washington, and it's a chilling reminder right now of the state of D.C. Behind me, what you see is not some far off, under the interstate, barren location. It's the Senate. 2 office buildings, in fact, that are the offices of dozens of senators. The Hart Building and Dirksen. What stands before it? 1, obviously, Nancy Pelosi's famous wall. You can see the garrison there. 2, a permanent homeless camp. A homeless camp that we don't know when exactly it popped up, the last couple months, but here it sits. This camp has not, by the way, been attempted to be, the city has attempted to move any of these people. They've actually brought in sanitation and waste. The city has used our tax dollars to fund the homeless camp. This is the absolute state of Washington, D.C., a city in decline. Very scary. On this episode of Benny on the Block, we're going to look at some of the realities of living in Washington, D.C., and what life is actually like for the people who live there, and who's really getting protected here today in Washington. Behind me, you see the miles-long fence that Congress has put up to protect themselves because they felt scared in Washington, D.C. Well, guess what? Join the club. Washington, D.C. has spent months and months this year under siege, riots, violence, affecting not just our most notable monuments, but also some of the more unfashionable areas of the city. Where I live, there have been multiple homicides. On this show, we have covered multiple areas of the city, not the fancy places where you might find the politicians, but places where normal people live. You have covered how young kids have been shot dead in the stoop of their homes. And guess what? We don't get a wall. We don't get a razor wire and military garrison in our houses, on our streets, protecting us. This is what Congress votes to protect themselves, while the normal people of D.C. have lived in carnage all summer and fall and winter long. I'm going to show you something right now. This is a video from my doorstep of an attempted homicide in my block that I captured with my own cameras. That is how normal people live in Washington, D.C. So don't believe this bullshit from people saying that suddenly they're scared to live here. This is what normal people live with every single day. It's wrong for us, it's wrong for them, but they didn't do anything to fix it when it was us, normal people, who were being threatened, normal businesses being threatened, normal, average Americans being threatened in the community. This is hypocrisy, and it's disgusting. There were nearly 1,000 violent crimes per 100,000 people in the District of Columbia in 2018. That is two times the national average rate of violent crime. DC, therefore, is twice as dangerous to live in than any other state on average. Last year, 187 people were killed, making Washington, D.C.'s homicide count the highest it's been in almost 2 decades. Homicides rose a staggering 19% in 2020 from the previous year. Assault with a dangerous weapon, a category of crime, rose 3% in 2020. Motor vehicle theft increased by a steep 50% in 2020. Arson crimes increased 63% in Washington, D.C. this year. Violent crimes are up in 2021 in comparison to 2020. Violent crimes are up by 1% in Washington, D.C. Since the start of 2021, this year, there have been 17 homicides, 15 sexual abuses, 182 robberies, and 317 instances of motor vehicle theft in Washington, D.C. That's 1 month of crime in this district, a
teeny district. Washington, D.C. is without a doubt one of the most dangerous places to live, and it has been that way. We don't get a wall. The powerful get a wall and security detail. Don't believe the BS that D.C. suddenly became dangerous. They didn't care when it was us. They only care about the powerful, the elite, and themselves. When it comes to the overall proportion of homeless residents, no state compares to Washington, D.C. Of the district's 700,000 residents, approximately 7,000 of them are homeless. 1 person out of 100 is homeless in Washington. That's 3 times what the number is in California overall. 19% of DC residents live below the US poverty guidelines. That's horrific. That's 1/5 of the city in poverty.
Space for lease, business for lease, business for sale. You see it all over the city. Washington, D.C., I've lived here for 10 years, used to be a place with bustling businesses. You couldn't even find spare space to put a business in. Now, all over the city, all you see are businesses for sale, business for lease. Why is this? This is specifically because Washington, D.C. had one of the most brutal lockdowns for coronavirus. They closed down restaurants multiple times, shut down the city, shut down businesses, and then allowed the mobs and the rioters to loot them. This was happened all summer long. It was horrifying for businesses, and those that were not corporately sponsored shuttered. Right now, DC is a ghost of its former self. Many business owners tell me that it will be years before DC gets back, if it ever comes back. This is a sad sign for a once bustling city.
Nearly half of small businesses closed in Washington, D.C. due to COVID-19 and the restrictions placed on the businesses by the leftists who run this city drove businesses into the ground unnecessarily. This is cruelty.
One of the other things you end up seeing in this city now in Washington, D.C. is apartment for rent, house for sale, studio for rent. Places are going onto the market because people are fleeing. This city has become expensive, it's become dangerous, and much of the business associated with it has been sent out of the city vis-a-vis the coronavirus and the draconian lockdowns that have affected our city. This is what is happening to your nation's capital. Union Station, the crown jewel of Washington, D.C., architecturally one of the most beautiful buildings here in one of America's most prized, beautiful cities, now sent to ruin, absolutely empty. You are here in the middle of the day, in the middle of a work day, in a place that would have been one of the busiest, most bustling, most thriving areas of the city. Trains coming in and out, metro station coming in and out, a bunch of restaurants, businesses by the dozen completely shuttered. This is a direct result of DC taking itself off the map when it comes to tourism and off the map when it comes to location you would want to visit or do business in. In front of the White House, now the home of Joe Biden. What is Joe Biden protected by? Walls. Not 1, not 2, not 3, layers of walls. Here in BLM Plaza, the same thing. Gates, walls, refuse, barriers, police. Why? Because this is precisely the reflection of the entire dynamic of Washington, D.C. The protection for the powerful and the rest of us left to fend for ourselves. A city in decline, a city of chaos, where violence, mobs, riots reign supreme, where homeless encampments are allowed to spread to some of the most iconic areas of the city, where the residents live in fear and are fleeing, where people are losing their jobs and businesses are crumbling, cratering, but the powerful are safe and sound, protected behind the same walls and barriers that they called racist, that they called evil for the last 4 years. Protected behind big, beautiful walls where they feel safe. The rest of us left to fend for ourselves in the nightmare that they created. This is the absolute ruin of Washington, D.C. This is what the left is doing to your nation's capital. Do not let them do it to your city. This has been Benny on the block in Washington in a blizzard. Benny in the blizzard on the block. See you next week.